thank you all. It's wonderful to be here. I'm always happy to be back in Oxford, to be with both old friends and new. I want to thank especially Kevin and Ella for preparing the way for this visit, and especially to Dr. Jamie Harker, whose work has so informed my own. I keep returning to it again and again, finding new insights, so I really appreciate it. I'm really honored to present this lecture at high noon on International Workers' Day. As a union member for nearly 20 years, I'd particularly like to express solidarity with my fellow queer workers and my fellow immigrant workers as they're rallying today around the country and around the world. So, just over 50 years ago, in southeastern Spain, at 10:22 a.m. on Monday, 17 January 1966, women and men working the tomato fields of Palomares heard and felt a massive blast. Jolted, they saw an immense fireball overhead and watched in horror as burning wreckage began plummeting to earth. Schoolgirls rushed to classroom windows, then backed away, shocked at the spectacle. Teacher Conchita Fernandez tried to calm them, restore order, and explain. What happened was easy to deduce. For years, almost daily, two pairs of planes had coupled over Palomares for mid-air refueling, a regular feature of the morning sky. Today, no doubt, one coupling had gone horribly wrong. Specifically, a U.S. Air Force B-52 bomber had closed too rapidly on its tanker plane. The two Boeing aircraft collided and exploded. At the boys' school, some were shouting, others crying, as tons of aluminum came crashing down within yards of the building. The language teacher instructed his students to keep quiet and remain inside. The math teacher, assuming an earthquake, marched his boys outside. He ordered them to spread out and stretch out on the ground. Huge chunks of twisted metal, a wing, an entire tail section, flaming debris, and smaller pieces were falling all over. From the impact of the aluminum, restaurant worker Isabel Jordan was knocked down in her front yard, suffering abrasions, contusions, lacerations, and back damage so severe she never worked again. With airplane parts raining on her roof louder than hail, Josefa Molina raced from her house, collapsed, broke both arms, wounded her leg, sustaining injuries that proved fatal. She died several weeks later. Things went from bad to worse. There was another explosion west of town, then another terrifyingly close within the town proper. Too young for school, two brothers playing outdoors were slammed into the dirt along with their great uncle. Now there was more flying metal, shrapnel of a sort. Windows shattered, power lines were cut, the electricity went out. Downwind of Palomares in Villaricos, smoke everywhere, women filleting fish dropped their work and hurried home. Some thought war had come. Unbeknownst to townspeople, the US B-52 flying home to North Carolina from Soviet borders carried 4 hydrogen bombs, which fell in a line from west to east. Whereas parachutes deployed on 2 bombs and they descended intact, later recovered, the first 2 hit the earth at speed and their conventional explosives detonated. So the West Palomares and East Palomares bombs were blown to bits, scattering radioactive plutonium, a mutagen and carcinogen, over the towns and fields. So I'll just quickly explain. This is a BBC map that's largely accurate except for the place name for Palomares. The place name for Palomares is right between that red and that third bomb. That third bomb is within the city limits of Palomares. The church is just up there within the darker zone. The town square just below it, where I lived for the winter of 2011-12, is just below that on a little street called 17 January 1966 Crossing. 7 airmen died, all found near the West Palomares bomb site, where locals gathered body parts. As one explained, we were pulling out arms, legs, bits of neck, clothes, even burnt wristwatches to identify the dead. These volunteers wore no gloves, no masks. Despite severe radioactive contamination immediately apparent to U.S. authorities, they evacuated no one. Under U.S. nuclear top secrecy and Spanish dictatorial censorship, they informed no one for 6 weeks. Over time, they sealed or destroyed many records, which helps to answer, in part, this lecture's central question concerning cultural amnesia. If Palomares is considered the worst nuclear weapons disaster in history, why do so few people outside Spain know about it? As I will argue, the cover-up was both literal and figurative, reflecting the worst excesses of U.S. imperialism and unilateralism, recast as American heroism and generosity. In 4 parts, the lecture asks first, how were initial reports of the Palomares disaster censored or circulated, distorted or clarified, falsified or verified? How did generals, journalists, diplomats, and technocrats refute local accounts? Second, why did editorial cartoonists choose to highlight this disaster? How did they thereby critique American and Spanish deception? Third, despite widespread international condemnation of reckless U.S. militarism, how did Pentagon officials resist reproach and insist upon American benevolence in Palomares? How did they reproduce the reigning narratives of U.S. magnanimity around the incident, never the disaster, the incident? Finally, how did dissidents aligned with the Spanish Republic in exile protest both the nuclear state of emergency and everyday totalitarianism in U.S. allied Spain? Why did some choose nonviolent resistance through broadcasting, publishing, marching, and demonstrating, while others attempted to overthrow the Franco dictatorship via kidnapping and assassination? As becomes all too obvious, in siege mentality America and across its Cold War anti-communist outposts, state of exception authoritarianism had become the rule. Run by top brass, top bureaucrats, and revolving door defense contractors, the military-industrial complex pursued its grand plans for global dominance while externalizing the costs of nuclear aggression, radioactive contamination, and environmental degradation. Costs that all of us, but particularly the people of Palomares, continue to pay. As I said, the lecture's in 4 sections, and the first is titled Code Names and Double Talk. Costing $55 million, John Woo's second Hollywood blockbuster contains at least one good line. It's spoken by a young, not yet jaded Washington aide. "I don't know what's scarier," he declares incredulous, "losing nuclear weapons, or that it happens so often there's actually a term for it." The code name for it, the title of Woo's 1996 action film, is Broken Arrow. The U.S. Defense Department formally concedes 32 broken arrows. Swedish monitors estimate 125. Investigative journalist Eric Schlosser counts upwards of 100 for the 1950s alone, for the U.S. Air Force alone. The Army and Navy, he notes, failed to keep track. Given these institutional histories of dereliction and concealment, the Air Force template response was to first deny, then minimize Broken Arrow 29 at Palomares, confounding most American journalists and thus the American people. Initially, at least, reporters seemed up to the challenge, attuned to the subterfuge. On 17 January 1966, for example, many American newspaper readers learned about the ominous accident before their president. Testament to a free press, European bureaus of AP, UPI, and Reuters issued bulletins within an hour or two of the crash, before sunrise in America. So perceptive editors on the graveyard shift made it front page news from Reno to Kokomo, Sikeston to Gettysburg, Ocala to Tuscaloosa. The Air Force, they reported, would not say whether the B-52 was carrying nuclear bombs. President Lyndon Johnson was first informed in his breakfast briefing. Covering their ass after their colossal fuck-up, Pentagon officials falsified reports to the White House declaring the affected area uninhabited, the radiation effects nil, while around the world, responsible journalists challenged U.S. military deceit. The next day, German-language papers and Australian Associated Press hinted the B-52 carried nuclear weapons. 2 days later, when UPI suggested radiation hazards in Palomares, forcing the U.S. to finally inform the Spanish government, if not the Spanish people, the UPI Madrid bureau chief was summoned to the embassy and dressed down by American Ambassador Angier Duke, a name you'll recognize. Heir of the North Carolina tobacco, electricity, and university family, Duke crafted his own press release about what he called the tiny village. The usage stuck, and American corporate media fell in line. Just 500 short of a city under contemporaneous U.S. Census standards, the 2,000 people in Palomares thereafter were subjected to unrelenting condescension and belittling discourses. For most of the U.S. press, as the left-wing news weekly National Guardian put it, the 4 hydrogen bombs in Spain were quite a joke. Irony of ironies, the very week of the Palomares disaster, America's widest circulation news weekly, Time magazine, featured a flattering cover portrait of 73-year-old General Franco in business suit, a 14-page puff piece within. Given lengthy advanced production schedules, this extraordinary fluke could not be avoided. Issues had been mailed. Many were already atop coffee tables. So this particular edition of Time inadvertently reminded readers, as vital as U.S. political, military, and economic support for the otherwise isolated regime was its vast cultural apparatus of endorsement, legitimizing the dictatorship. As yet, Spain was not a part of NATO. The European community had isolated them. Only the U.S. helped to get them into the United Nations. In return, U.S. corporations secured exclusive contracts. U.S. military bases marred the landscape. Where once Hitler pulled the strings, historian Bill Trifle writes of anti-fascist opinion, the Generalissimo was a puppet now manipulated by Uncle Sam. Indeed, with U.S. largesse, Franco would rule another decade, nearly 4 in all, until his death, age 83. Even so, despite the lucrative long-term relationship, Franco demonstrated his extreme concern about the disaster by temporarily suspending U.S. overflight rights. Franco's number 2 had been led to believe these dangerous refuelings happened over water, and Spanish authorities feared continuing U.S. duplicity, rightly so. In addition to these air-launched weapons of the nuclear triad, submarine-launched missiles had also been slipped into Spain by trickery. As one Washington insider put it, by legal double talk and sleight of hand, the U.S. Navy docked Polaris subs with Westinghouse nuclear reactors, not to mention nuclear warheads, at its Rota base in Cadiz. That's near Gibraltar, right at the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea. So Spanish nuclear scientists, many of them trained in the States, had good reason to doubt U.S. physicists, as well as Westinghouse and Union Carbide technicians, dictating acceptable levels of contamination in Palomares. Haggling behind closed doors, with no international oversight, Spanish and American scientists, diplomats, and generals charted the fate of Palomares and Villaricos. It didn't bode well. Faced with the difficult problem of decontaminating the sides of houses, for example, they solved it by applying several layers of paint. As we shall see, like this whitewash, this was a traditional Pueblo Blanco, it's a white village. Like this whitewash, the cover-up was not only figurative, but also literal. In the 1950s and 60s, the US war on communism ran hot and cold, involving both armed national conflicts, Korea followed by Vietnam, and everyday aggressions such as Air Force Operation Chrome Dome, which kept these B-52 hydrogen bombers in flight 24/7 along 4 routes to and from Soviet borders. Did you know that throughout the 60s, B-52 bombers were perpetually in flight overhead with hydrogen bombs, 4 being the typical payload? With 750,000 refuelings and millions of nuclear weapons movements, a 1 in a million accident became a dead cert. Architects of such absurd defense policies thus sent 7 airmen to their deaths on 17 January 1966, plus 8 more in a Palomares supply plane crash. On the ground, countless others were, and still are, subjected to potentially fatal radioactive exposures. But US and Spanish deception ensured we will never know all their stories. Now, my second section is titled Top Secrecy and Counter Discourse. While too many American journalists accepted spoon-fed accounts and others across the globe struggled to get accurate information, editorial cartoonists kept the Palomares disaster alive in public discourse. Like court jesters ribbing the very rulers who retained them, cartoonists poked fun at puffed-up politicos, offering grim insights into human frailty, raw power, and secrecy's corrosive effects on democracy. In the post-Hiroshima atomic age, theirs was a brave bid to forestall human annihilation. In 1966, cartoon artists at East Coast establishment publications understood the general import, but misgauged the relative significance of events in Spain. For example, whereas the Washington Post's multi-Pulitzer Prize winner Herbert Bloch, or Herblock, devoted at least 3 cartoons to the disaster, he spoofed US generals and their minions, rendering the people of Palomares mute. Even so, his broad critiques of official incompetence proved prescient of Pentagon deceit. In an influential 1957 cartoon on what is now called overclassification, 2 federal bureaucrats prepare documents for the file cabinets. Well, we certainly botched this job, one admits, hoping to conceal it. What'll we stamp it, secret or top secret? London cartoonist Keith Waite came closer to portraying the lived realities in Palomares after the bombs. In one of 3 cartoons for The Sun, Waite depicts contaminated fields closed to farmers and photographers, with prominent signage warning in all caps, "Keep out." Absolutely no danger, it adds sarcastically, merely an H-bomb. Waite invents a warning sign where unconscionably there were none. As the US military's Palomares summary report states, with chilling indifference, quote, "The politics of the situation negated the placing of contaminated area signs." Waite sympathizes with the locals who might have read such a notice, along with underinformed servicemen made to measure radioactivity, recover wreckage, and clean up. For Waite, a radiation reading perhaps signals a bomb site's proximity, but more so its human hazards. With dark double entendre, a GI with Geiger counter tells another, "You're getting warm." Waite's four flags blowing in the breeze subtly critiqued the myth of a zero line of radiation containment, staked with flags by U.S. servicemen. I mean, once this cat's out of the bag, you can't contain it. Plutonium was found in Germany from this disaster. Indeed, aligned with the compass, Waite's flags wave eastward to the right, demonstrating a fundamental environmental problem for townspeople. As you might remember from that BBC slide, prevailing westerly winds blowing from west to east carried contaminants from the West Palomares bomb site directly into the town center. These winds furthermore carried contaminants from the East Palomares bomb site across the Almanzora River, onto and over the Almaguer foothills, and directly into Villaricos, as suggested by the parallel dashed lines at the upper right edge of this slide. As Spanish government scientist Eduardo Ramos freely conceded at an international conference in Switzerland, Villaricos, too, was contaminated, quote, several kilometers beyond the putative, the so-called zero line. From Cleveland to Karachi, Madrid to Moscow, cartoons mocked U.S. conduct in Spain. Pravda lampooned LBJ and his dogs scuba diving for bombs at Radioactive Beach. Of American cartoonists, only Egyptian-born Jean-Claude Suarez represented the disaster as a tragedy foremost for the people of Palomares. In a daring series for Underground Weekly, The Realist, Suarez depicts clumsy GIs examining townsfolk for radioactive exposures, lower left, then forcing them to strip off and burn their contaminated clothes. In Spain's poorest province, this was no small burden. Instructed to burn her dress, Ana Josefa Lopez told authorities she didn't have any others. In that case, they advised she should wash it with strong detergent. Replacing her clothes apparently was out of the question. As we shall see, American officers refused reimbursements for damages to most real property and personal effects. Only the National Guardian photographed locals' medical examinations or reported the clothes burning with sympathy. Thus did savvy political cartoonists have to imagine scenes under or unreported in Palomares, all the while criticizing the universalizing dangers of aerial bombardment. It's probably worth just recalling that, right around just before the First World War, international diplomats met in The Hague in the Netherlands and agreed not to engage in aerial bombardment, right? So likely were aerial bombardments to kill civilians, non-combatants. So, about aerial bombardment. At the end of a long career battling injustice from Nazism to imperialism, German-British cartoonist Vicky Weiss depicted Lyndon Johnson as the Statue of Liberty, holding his Great Society legislation in one hand, dropping a bomb with the other. Published in the New Statesman in February 1966, the cartoon referenced both Spain and Vietnam, as well as a bleak history of U.S. bombardment around the world. Indeed, just 6 months before, on the 20th anniversary of Hiroshima, New Statesman had printed Vicky's harrowing black ink mushroom cloud, uncaptioned, ill-omened. Vicky fell into a downward spiral. Days after the LBJ cartoon, he committed suicide. As Vicky's LBJ cartoon hints, even on the political left, Vietnam overrode all other Cold War concerns in the mid-60s, and few noticed the severity of the Palomares disaster or appreciated its far-reaching implications. And Noam Chomsky, for example, has confirmed this for me. However, Palomares cartoonists persisted, signaling their determination to undo government euphemism, to correct reporters' oversights, and to keep the public curious. The cartoons encouraged citizens to ask questions that seemed otherwise off the table or behind closed doors. Now, my third section is called compensation or reparations. If you'll stick with me through this, the fourth section gives us some hope, okay? The 1966 U.S. compensation program in Palomares was highly contested, noisy, and rancorous. Instead of engaging the World Court, as local protesters demanded, the U.S. acted unilaterally, adjudicating claims through a three-man commission of their own military officers. Though even the U.S. Secretary of State urged generous, expeditious payments, Defense Department officials who footed the bill proved mean and stingy. Their natural concern, they conceded, was to minimize costs as a precedent for future contamination incidents, the biggest happening only 2 years later in Danish Greenland. Offering individual compensation instead of collective reparations, no apology, no promise to desist, the U.S. program ignored community health and regional environmental concerns, remunerating only immediate verifiable economic losses such as crop destruction. Thus, landowners and some tenant farmers benefited, recovering nearly 2/3 of their claims, whereas ordinary wage laborers suffered, receiving only 1/3 of theirs. Of a total of 595 claimants, 492 were partially recompensed. Among 91 wholly rejected were small-scale vendors who could no longer sell their eggs, lemons, or produce boxes since agricultural markets collapsed on news of contamination. Local economic hierarchies and inequalities thus were exacerbated. Loyal, landed Francoists were rewarded, the working classes penalized. As we see here, of the over 1.5 million in damage claims, approximately 545,000 was paid, of which crop loss comprised 523,000, or 96% of all payments. If you owned crops and the U.S. destroyed them by contaminating them with plutonium, you might get reimbursed. So, for example, 17 male members of the Navarro extended family, a surname still prominent on the landscape today, received upwards of $70,000. Of those, Juan Navarro Serrano was paid 64% of his claim, and Jose Rodriguez Navarro was paid 85% of his claim. Similarly, Palomares' part-time mayor, Jose Manuel Gonzalez, aligned with the Franco regime, received 88% of his claim. As apparent in the fourth row of this slide, workers and farmhands thrown out of their jobs when GIs closed fields for cleanup claimed $43,000 but received only $14,000, or 32%. Expectant mother Francisca Navarro, again that name comes up, attributed her miscarriage to the disaster, but her request for recompense was initially denied. In the end, as the penultimate row suggests, U.S. authorities conceded some level of culpability, paying just over half of a $1,250 claim. As the last row makes clear, widely reported psychological damages were scarcely claimed and always refused. Under American accounting, such psychological distress amounted to nothing. So let's think this through, right? Under U.S. nuclear top secrecy, behaving deceptively throughout, American authorities accused Spaniards of behaving deceptively, of overstating their damages. Implicitly charged with dishonesty, 10 claimants whose losses totaled $38,000 refused the paltry $8,000 settlements altogether. Thus, in Spain's poorest province, under these highly asymmetrical power relations, the adjudicators were also judged and found wanting. Perhaps the most poignant refusals were those of the small orchard owners whose fruit trees withered and died after U.S. servicemen stole and depleted local water stocks, to hose down their radioactive rubbish heaps, a vain attempt to curtail windborne proliferation of contaminants. Interviewed by documentarian Dina Hecht for the UK Channel 4 for her film Broken Arrow 29, Pepe Martinez recounts the moment when U.S. military Captain Joe Ramirez made him a final offer of compensatory damages for his family's ruined farm. As Martinez explains, I lost 11 acres of watermelon fields and another field with 74 orange trees. They cut off my water. So I lost my trees and the melon crop. Martinez filed a claim of $10,000, but Ramirez made a cold-blooded counteroffer, a mere 1% that didn't cover the current crop, much less the dead citrus grove and the long-term loss of livelihood. Pepe Martinez refused the payment, insisting they send it to those poor wretches in Vietnam. You can send them $100 on my behalf. As Martinez elaborates, a general was in the car. Ramirez said, "Watch it, he's a general." "So what?" I said. "I'm my own person, and you're trespassing. Either pay up or take your leave." They left, and Martinez never accepted the measly payment, suggesting that in the complex dynamics of the Spanish dictatorship and American occupation, many in Palomares put principle over payment. I don't use the phrase American occupation lightly. There were 5 American bases on Spanish soil in these days, and I would just ask you to think about how you would feel about a Spanish base in your backyard, especially if they were transporting nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, in an egregious case of environmental racism, white officers ordered African American servicemen to cut down contaminated crops, scrape hot soil off the fields, shovel it into 5,000 barrels, then shift the barrels onto a ship for transport and burial. Where? At the Savannah River site in South Carolina. U.S. officials declared the Almaguera foothills too rugged and too onerous to decontaminate, and they simply left them untreated, thereby perpetuating the contamination of Villaricos downwind. Further, though they promised to take it all away, and with the help of African American stevedores, as they were called, most of it was taken away, nonetheless, Americans left behind more of the radioactive debris, buried at the West Palomares bomb site in 2 massive unlined trenches, the literal cover-up. A British journalist's book from the period referred to it bluntly as the soil burial area. The government of Spain did not discover it until 2008, evidencing the effectiveness of U.S. deception. American officers insisted that their reimbursement program was generous. Over-generous, said one, considering how these people live. In fact, while meagerly compensating Palomares property damage, almost entirely crops, the United States has never accepted liability for loss of livelihoods when the regional economy collapsed, nor for loss of lives, even as several have been attributed to the disaster. Though they partly compensated deaths in a handful of cases, such as Francisca Navarro's miscarriage and Josefa Molina's fatal injuries fleeing falling wreckage, these were ex gratia payments, in-kind outlays, conceding no legal liability. Though U.S. officials never placed warning signs, many poor townspeople immediately sent their children away to distant relatives. Roughly half of all townspeople later immigrated, an exodus unelaborated in American accounts of the aftermath. A demographic shift making systematic medical follow-up problematic, if not moot. There have been no long-term health checks of the 1,600 U.S. servicemen involved in cleanup, or of the residents of Villaricos and Palomares, other than a fractional 150-person subset of the latter. With contaminants still buried on the surface and on the wind, a multi-millennial hazard remains. Thank you for staying with me. My fourth and final section is called Demonstrations or Assassination. With a lifespan of 240,000 years, plutonium proliferates anxiety and paranoia with its capacity to kill now or much later. The nuclear uncanny, as Joseph Masco theorizes it, renders the radiated homeland tricky, otherworldly, unhomely. Yet after the exodus from Palomares, those who remained had to make it their home. Canny locals thus organized for reasonable restitution and demonstrated against continuing contamination. It tainted everything, but somehow life trundled on. From the beginning, farmers in Palomares protested expulsion from their fields, and fishers in Villaricos protested closure of their shore, with up to 34 U.S. ships at anchor and up to 58 U.S. helicopter sorties per day over a 3-month period. Right, this place was turned into a de facto military base. Unable to hunt or fish, many locals starved, and as several testified, they were forced to scavenge American rubbish. Fiery demonstrations were mounted from the regional seat of Cuevas to the national capital of Madrid, whereas respected publications such as Le Monde reported these demonstrations, U.S. officials downplayed them, and the dictatorship attempted to deny them altogether. Whereas Radio Independent Spain, headquartered in Bucharest, transmitted fairly reliable newscasts over the Pyrenees, Franco's Minister for Information, Manuel Fraga, ensured that Spanish newspapers revealed next to nothing. Moreover, Fraga dramatically went swimming with American Ambassador Duke, cameras rolling, to prove the Mediterranean's safety. But this was a cynical diversionary tactic, shifting the gaze from land to sea, averting eyes from the atrocity, and making the harmless fourth bomb at the bottom of the Med for 80 days the principal source of journalistic interest. Do you follow me? To this day, some American reporters refer to the swim-in with admiration as a public relations masterpiece. But it hardened Spanish revolve against the dictatorship and its American sponsors. Indeed, that summer, Spanish anti-fascists, including Alicia Morcine, upper right, were arrested just before carrying out their plan to kidnap Ambassador Duke and Rear Admiral Norman Gillette. The object of the kidnapping, according to one activist, was to denounce the U.S. military presence in Spain, to protest against the 2 atomic bombs, and to demand the release of Spain's political prisoners. Author and activist Isabel Alvarez, the Duchess of Medina Sidonia, would become one of those political prisoners. On the Palomares disaster first anniversary, 17 January 1967, U.S. reporters undercounted a demonstration of 1,000 locals as 40. And the Franco regime jailed organizers Francisco Cervantes and Isabel Alvarez, maligned as the Red Duchess. So watch how this works. Quoting AP reports, U.S. editors provided a neat, if false, summary of the previous year's activities, as in the second paragraph here, with its exculpating, obfuscating, passive verb constructions. Quote, the bombs were recovered, the area cleansed of atomic radiation, and the people reimbursed. In fact, the U.S. has never fully recovered 2 of the bombs, never fully remediated the West or East Palomares bomb sites, now fenced, the Almagrera foothills, likewise fenced. The Villaricos or Palomares town centers, unfenced, where people still live and work. U.S. officials have never fully reimbursed locals. Alvarez was incarcerated nearly a year in the women's prison at Alcalá. She used the time wisely, writing history, teaching literacy, befriending fallen women, allying with dissidents such as Alicia Morcin, and surreptitiously outlining her jail memoir, My Prison. Within days of release in late 1969, Alvarez began to publish a serialized version in Spain's weekly Saturday Graphic. Though her account was toned down to get past the censors, the magazine was suspended for 4 months, and Alvarez received notice from the Special Court for Press Offenses that she again would be arrested. Instead, she fled to France, where she lived in exile from 1970 to 1976. During this period, she increasingly was politicized as an out lesbian, as she expanded her critique of American militarism and Spanish class conflict, contributing to a transatlantic network of writers and activists, calling for Franco's ouster and a transition to democracy. In Paris, Alvarez found Herma Brifo, the prolific translator of Colette and Duras, among others, to render her unexpurgated English-language edition of My Prison for Harper and Row. In addition to 2 descriptions that bookend the narrative, the Palomares disaster is the subject of the memoir's climax. A few months into her sentence, Alvarez is called before parole board members who are ready to free her early on one condition. And you can imagine what this looks like. You know, one of the parole officers will be a Catholic priest, one will be a nun, a sister who helps run this all-women's prison. They put the question to me, do you repent? Instead of answering, I told them about the people of Palomares whose livelihood was threatened by that nuclear catastrophe, which had been made possible by treaties with the USA, signed by a Spanish government no one had elected. My Prison received a lengthy favorable essay in the New York Review of Books, but major American daily newspapers ignored it. Across the political spectrum, from Republicans to liberals, anarchists to socialists, activists weighed options for the Spanish Republican exile. Dictatorial intransigence and American subterfuge pushed them toward violent resistance. In addition to this kidnap attempt, they hatched many plots to assassinate Franco and his henchmen. Most successful was Operation Ogre, which in 1973 killed Franco's prime minister on his way to church by dynamiting his Dodge Dart over the top of a 5-story building in central Madrid. Now, this was a pretty cagey operation, right? So, anti-fascists described themselves as artists who rented an apartment and then said they were going to use the basement to build sculpture. And instead of building sculpture, they were tunneling under the street where they knew the Prime Minister would be driven by his chauffeur in his Dodge Dart to church at the same time every week. And literally, they dynamited the car over the top of this building. Even after Franco's death in 1975, the Spanish Nuclear Regulatory Commission remained a Francoist preserve. It sealed Palomares medical records for 20 years, and even then released only partial falsified data. Townspeople discovered that their birth dates were frequently inaccurate, the errors consistently overstating their age, such that premature death would go undetected. This is not just a transcription from 13 to 31. There are many more of these examples. A U.S. treaty with Spain promised Palomares a seawater desalination plant as a gesture of goodwill, no reference to contamination. But it was instead another American corporate boondoggle. The contractor eventually was sold on to Coca-Cola at a handsome profit, even as the desalination plant failed. So, in sum, dissidents fighting Franchismo knew that their enemy was backed by a powerful military sponsor, with a sturdy diplomatic network, a domineering economic system, and of equal import, an imposing cultural apparatus. So one final example of that. In the penultimate page of her book, listen to the title of this book, "One of Our H-Bombs is Missing," American journalist Flora Lewis insisted genetic mutations from plutonium exposure in Palomares, the birth of a mongoloid, a defective child, an animal freak, would be impossible to distinguish from abnormalities resulting from rural incest. Generation after generation of intermarriage, as she asserted, without evidence. Like so many Americans, Lewis thereby belittled and blamed the victims. It was a means to simplify violence and underestimate in advance and in retrospect the human and environmental costs, all serving to smooth the way, as literary critic Rob Nixon theorizes, for amnesia. So, let's wrap up. As I hope I've demonstrated, first in league with the Franco dictatorship, American generals and diplomats minimized, even trivialized, the Palomares disaster, aided by American corporate media, stenographers for the powerful. Second, political cartoonists kept the disaster alive in public discourse and at their best brought greater attention to the plight of the people in Palomares despite widespread American indifference. Third, the U.S. program of individual compensation for property damage proved miserly and unjust, a quick fix for a multimillennial dilemma. Coupled with the literal cover-up, a clandestine radioactive dump in Spain, American top secrecy was exposed as a pretext for fraud. Finally, while American leftists critiqued U.S. imperial expansionism, focused largely on Vietnam, Spanish Republicans daringly protested against its nuclear dangers, even attempting to kidnap U.S. figurehead Angier Duque and successfully assassinating Franco's prime minister, a violence of last resort after decades of U.S.-sponsored totalitarianism.
Hey.
We're finishing up. After 2016, the 50th anniversary of the disaster, with continued U.S. foot-dragging and the EU urging action, the best way forward may be collective reparations, a revolving fund with adequate resources to redress the ultra-long-term consequences of radiological slow violence. The next logical step would seem to be a formal complaint to the International Court of Justice in The Hague against American hegemony and its asymmetrical bilateral relations. Our best hopes may lie in bodies of global governance and in multilateral resolve. That really is the end.